Imagine the map room at the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam headquarters in Saigon, circa 1967. General William Westmoreland stands over a sprawling topographical map of the Indochinese peninsula, his eyes tracing the narrow waist of the country, moving past the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel, and locking on to the ultimate prize, Hanoi. It is the forbidden fruit of American military strategy during the Cold War. For years, tactical commanders on the ground, frustrated by a war of attrition against an enemy that could simply bleed across the borders into Cambodia and Laos, begged for the leash to be taken off. They wanted to take the fight to the source, to cross the line, to march north, and to crush the North Vietnamese army in its own backyard. But the politicians in Washington flatly refused. Today we are going to tear up the history books and ask the ultimate tactical question. What if the United States had invaded North Vietnam? What if Lyndon B. Johnson had ignored the political scientists, unleashed the full conventional might of the United States Armed Forces, and ordered a massive combined arms assault on the heart of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam? Welcome to the channel, where we dissect the brutal mathematics of warfare, strip away the political spin, and analyze the raw tactical realities of history. If you want to understand the grim mechanics of combat and the strategies that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join the ranks of our tactical community. To understand why an invasion of North Vietnam was the war Washington feared above all else, we have to rewind the clock and look at the deep psychological scars left on the American military establishment. You cannot understand Vietnam without understanding the frozen hellscape of the Chosin Reservoir. In 1950, General Douglas MacArthur pushed United Nations forces north across the 38th parallel in Korea, aiming to wipe out the North Korean regime. He assured President Truman that the Chinese would not intervene. He was catastrophically wrong. 300,000 Chinese infantrymen of the People's Volunteer Army poured across the Yalu River, slamming into the exposed flanks of the U.S. 8th Army and the First Marine Division, triggering one of the longest and bloodiest retreats in American military history. That trauma was burned into the DNA of every Pentagon planner in the 1960s. The border between North Vietnam and China was not just a line on a map, it was a tripwire for World War III. By 1967, the People's Republic of China had successfully tested a nuclear weapon, and they had a mutual defense treaty with Hanoi. The Soviet Union was actively supplying the North Vietnamese with advanced surface-to-air missiles, fighter jets, and heavy artillery. Washington was paralyzed by the fear that if American boots crossed the DMZ, or if US Marines hit the beaches at Haiphong, it would trigger a massive conventional response from the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or worse, a nuclear exchange with the Soviets. But what if we remove that political paralysis for a moment and look purely at the military arithmetic? Let us assume the politicians gave the green light for Operation Rolling Thunder to become a ground invasion. We are looking at a hypothetical operational scenario in early 1968, just before the historical Tet Offensive. The United States military in Vietnam was at its absolute peak of operational readiness, fielding over 500,000 men. This was a force built on the doctrine of massive firepower, unparalleled air mobility, and overwhelming logistical superiority. If an invasion were to happen, it would not be a slow, grinding infantry push through the jungle. It would be a violent, multi-dimensional hammer blow designed to shatter the enemy's command and control in a matter of weeks. The invasion plan would likely mirror the audacity of Incheon, combining a massive amphibious landing with a deep air-mobile envelopment. Let us break down the order of battle for the United States. The spearhead of the amphibious assault would be the Third Marine Amphibious Force. We are talking about tens of thousands of hardened US Marines loaded onto landing ship tanks and amphibious assault ships of the US 7th Fleet, tasked with storming the beaches near the critical port city of Haiphong. They would be supported by naval gunfire from heavy cruisers and the 16-inch guns of the battleship USS New Jersey, capable of hurling 2,000-pound high-explosive shells 20 miles inland, obliterating coastal defenses. Once the beachhead was secured, the Marines would push inland toward Hanoi, relying on their organic armor. This means the M48A3 Patton tank. The Patton was a beast of a machine, weighing in at roughly 90,000 pounds, armed with a lethal 90mm rifled main gun, and powered by a V12 twin-turbo diesel engine. In the open plains of Europe, it was a formidable weapon. But here is the critical question. Do you really think a 45-ton piece of Detroit steel is going to maneuver effectively in the flooded rice paddies and muddy deltas of northern Vietnam? While the Marines secured the coast, the United States Army would execute the deepest vertical envelopment in military history. The First Cavalry Division, the pioneers of air-mobile warfare, would bypass the heavily fortified DMZ entirely. Imagine a sky blackened by over 400 UH-1 Iroquois helicopters, the iconic Hueys, carrying thousands of infantrymen directly into the strategic rear of the North Vietnamese army. Their objective would be to sever the logistical arteries connecting Hanoi to the southern battlefields, specifically targeting the rail lines and bridges running down from the Chinese border. These air-mobile infantrymen would be armed with the newly introduced M16A1 assault rifle, firing a lightweight 5.56mm round at 800 rounds per minute, supported by M60 machine guns and lightweight M102 105mm towed howitzers that could be sling-loaded beneath CH-47 Chinook helicopters. The sheer speed and flexibility of the 1st Cav would, in theory, allow them to outmaneuver the static defenses of the enemy. Simultaneously, a massive mechanized thrust would punch through the DMZ along Highway 1. This would be the anvil to the airmobile hammer. Elements of the U.S. Army's 24th Corps, heavily supported by M113 armored personnel carriers, would drive north. The M113, affectionately known as the Track, was a lightweight aluminum box carrying a squad of infantry armed with a .50 caliber heavy machine gun. It was designed as a battlefield taxi, but in Vietnam it was often used as a light tank, crashing through the brush and providing a mobile base of fire. This three-pronged assault would be covered by the most terrifying umbrella of close air support the world had ever seen. The 7th Air Force, flying out of bases in Thailand and South Vietnam, would saturate the northern skies. F-4 Phantom IIs, screaming in at Mach 2, would drop thousands of pounds of napalm, white phosphorus, and Mark 82 500-pound general-purpose bombs on enemy troop concentrations. High above them, the B-52 Stratofortresses of the Strategic Air Command would conduct arc-light strikes. A single B-52 could carry up to 108 500-pound bombs, turning grids of jungle into lunar landscapes in a matter of seconds. But wars are not fought on paper, and the enemy gets a vote. And the enemy in this scenario is the People's Army of Vietnam, commanded by General Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap was not a man who fought on American terms. He was a master of asymmetric warfare, a student of Mao Zedong's protracted People's War, and the architect of the devastating French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. If the United States invaded the North, they would not be fighting the lightly armed Viet Cong guerrillas they were used to chasing in the Mekong Delta. They would be slamming headfirst into the regular, conventional divisions of the PAVN. We are talking about the steel core of the North Vietnamese military, units like the 308th Pioneer Division, the 304th, and the 312th. These were battle-hardened infantry divisions, highly disciplined, fiercely motivated, and intimately familiar with the brutal terrain of their homeland. Let us look at the North Vietnamese arsenal, because it was far from primitive. While the American infantrymen carried the M16, the PAVN regular was equipped with the Soviet-designed AK-47. Firing a heavier 7.62 by 39 mm round, the AK was a masterpiece of rugged simplicity, practically impervious to the mud, water, and grit that plagued the early models of the American M16. The PAVN also possessed significant armored assets. They fielded Soviet T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks, armed with a 100mm rifled gun that could easily punch through the armor of an American Patton at standard combat ranges. They also utilized the PT-76 amphibious light tank, a vehicle uniquely suited for the flooded river basins of the Red River Delta. But Giap's true trump card was not his armor, it was his artillery and his air defense network. The North Vietnamese had meticulously constructed one of the most dense and lethal integrated air defense systems in the history of modern warfare, around Hanoi and Haiphong. This was not a few guys with rifles shooting at aeroplanes. This was a multi-layered, radar-directed killing zone. At the lowest level, thousands of heavy machine guns and rapid-fire anti-aircraft cannons, ranging from 23mm Zu-23s to radar-guided 57mm S-60 batteries, created a wall of lead in the lower atmosphere. Above that, the skies were dominated by the S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2 Guidelines surface-to-air missile. This was a massive, two-stage, solid and liquid-fueled rocket that could accelerate to Mach 3.5, carrying a 434-pound fragmentation warhead. Directed by the Fan Song target tracking radar, the SA-2 was a deadly threat to American bombers and strike aircraft. To counter the American air armada, the North Vietnamese Air Force flew agile Soviet-supplied MiG-17 and MiG-21 interceptors. The MiG-21, armed with Atoll heat-seeking missiles, was a tiny delta-winged rocket fighter that specialized in high-speed, hit-and-run attacks against heavy American fighter bombers. If you are an American armored commander pushing north from the DMZ, how do you sustain your momentum when your supply lines are stretched over hundreds of miles of hostile territory? This brings us to the ultimate dictator of military campaigns: logistics. The American way of war required a staggering logistical tale. An armored division consumes hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel a day. An artillery battalion requires hundreds of tons of high-explosive shells just to maintain a standard rate of fire. The United States relied on massive deep-water ports like Cam Ranh Bay and Da Nang to offload these supplies, which were then trucked inland or flown in via C-130 Hercules cargo planes. In an invasion of the North, those supply lines would have to run through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Annamite mountain range, with its razor-sharp limestone karsts and triple canopy jungle, forms a natural fortress wall along the western spine of Vietnam. The coastal plains are narrow, easily choked off, and crisscrossed by hundreds of rivers and streams. And then there is the weather. The climate of North Vietnam is dictated by the monsoon seasons. From May to October, the southwest monsoon brings torrential rains, turning the ground into a bottomless soup of red clay and mud. During this period, close air support is severely degraded due to low cloud ceilings and poor visibility. Helicopters struggle to fly in the extreme turbulence and heavy downpours. Armored vehicles sink to their axles. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, had mastered the art of low-tech, decentralized logistics. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of hidden roads and footpaths, was a testament to their resilience. They moved thousands of tons of supplies using heavily modified bicycles, capable of carrying up to 400 pounds of cargo, pushed by civilian laborers through the jungle at night to avoid American airstrikes. They decentralized their supply depots, burying fuel tanks underground and hiding ammunition caches in deep cave systems. If the Americans invaded, Giap would not fight them in a massive set-piece battle where American firepower could annihilate his forces. He would trade space for time, drawing the American mechanized columns deep into the muddy valleys, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point, and then bleeding them dry with relentless ambushes, sniper fire, and massed artillery barrages from hidden positions in the mountains. We must also consider the geopolitical nightmare that would unfold the moment American boots hit the ground north of the 17th parallel. By 1967, there were already an estimated 300,000 Chinese engineering and anti-aircraft troops stationed inside North Vietnam, tasked with repairing bombed-out infrastructure and manning the air defense grids. An American invasion would inevitably result in direct combat between U.S. forces and the Chinese military. The Chinese leadership in Beijing had drawn a red line, stating clearly that if the United States threatened the existence of the North Vietnamese state, China would intervene, just as they had in Korea. The Soviet Union, while perhaps less willing to commit ground troops, had dozens of merchant ships anchored in Haiphong harbor, unloading vital war material. An American amphibious assault on Haiphong would run the very real risk of sinking Soviet vessels and killing Soviet sailors, an act that could easily escalate into a global superpower conflict. The American military planners knew all of this. They understood the terrain, they respected the enemy's resilience, and they feared the geopolitical fallout. But the frustration of fighting a limited war with one hand tied behind their backs was a bitter pill to swallow. The tactical allure of a decisive knockout blow against Hanoi remained a persistent fantasy in the halls of the Pentagon. If the order had been given, the initial American assault would have been a display of shock and awe unparalleled in modern history. The sheer weight of American steel, the thunder of naval gunfire, and the swarm of air-mobile infantry would have shattered the initial North Vietnamese defensive lines. But what happens on day 30? What happens when the monsoon rains begin to fall, when the Chinese divisions start massing on the border, and when the American logistical tail becomes bogged down in a hostile, unforgiving landscape? The trap is set, the invasion force is committed, and the greatest military machine on Earth is about to march into a meat grinder that will test the very limits of human endurance and tactical ingenuity. The reality of the Red River Delta would hit the American mechanized forces like a sledgehammer. To understand the tactical nightmare of a ground invasion in North Vietnam, you must first understand the ground itself. This is not the triple canopy jungle of the Central Highlands, nor is it the sprawling, relatively open rubber plantations near Saigon. The Red River Delta is a heavily populated, intensely cultivated floodplain, crisscrossed by a labyrinth of rivers, canals, and centuries-old earthen dikes. These dikes, some of them 30 feet high and wide enough to drive a truck on, were built to hold back the monsoon floods. But in a military context, they are prefabricated fortifications. Think of the bocage country of Normandy during World War II, where American Sherman tanks were trapped in narrow hedgerow lanes and slaughtered by hidden German anti-tank guns. The Red River Delta is the Asian equivalent of the bocage, but instead of solid earth, the ground between the dikes is a bottomless soup of water and mud. How do you maneuver a 45-ton M48 Patton tank in a sea of mud? The brutal answer is, you do not. The Patton, with its 90mm main gun and heavy cast steel armor, was designed to fight Soviet armor on the Fulda Gap in Germany. It has a ground pressure of roughly 12 pounds per square inch. In the flooded rice paddies of the north, it would sink to its belly pan within minutes, throwing its tracks and becoming a stationary steel pillbox. The American mechanized advance, spearheaded by the 24th Corps pushing up Highway 1, would be strictly road-bound. Highway 1, in 1968, was a narrow paved ribbon elevated above the paddies, essentially a giant causeway. This strips the American armor of its greatest asset, maneuverability. You cannot flank the enemy if you cannot leave the road. General Vo Nguyen Giap knew this, and his tactical doctrine for defending the north relied heavily on the ambush. As the American columns ground their way north, they would face a gauntlet of anti-tank hunter-killer teams, equipped with the Soviet RPG-7. Let us dissect the mechanics of this weapon, because it fundamentally altered infantry warfare. The RPG-7 fires a rocket-propelled grenade equipped with a high-explosive anti-tank or heat warhead. This is a shaped charge. When the 85mm warhead strikes a tank, an explosive lens detonates, inverting a conical copper liner and turning it into a hypervelocity jet of molten metal, traveling at over 25,000 feet per second. This copper jet punches through solid steel armor like a high-pressure water hose through mud, instantly incinerating the crew inside and detonating the tank's ammunition magazine. A $200 tube of stamped steel, wielded by a single hidden infantryman, can obliterate a $250,000 American tank. Giap's forces would pre-sight these weapons along every choke point, every bridge crossing, and every bend in Highway 1. The American advance would become a grueling, bloody crawl, clearing every dike and every village, foot by foot. While the mechanized forces bled on the highway, the amphibious assault at Haiphong would be unleashing its own specific brand of hell. The United States Marine Corps is the premier amphibious force on the planet. But storming Haiphong in 1968 would make the invasion of Tarawa look like a rehearsal. The Soviet Union had heavily invested in the defense of this vital port. Before the first marine amphibious tractor, the LVT-5, even hit the water, the US Navy would have to clear massive, dense minefields. We are talking about hundreds of Soviet-made contact and magnetic acoustic mines seeded throughout the harbor approaches. The moment the minesweepers moved in, they would be engaged by dug-in coastal defense batteries. The North Vietnamese fielded the Soviet M46 130mm field gun. This was a devastating piece of artillery with a maximum range of over 17 miles, capable of firing a 73-pound high-explosive fragmentation shell. These guns were deeply entrenched in concrete bunkers carved into the limestone cliffs overlooking the coastline, making them nearly impervious to counter-battery fire or standard aerial bombardment. When the Marines finally hit the beaches, they would not be facing a retreating enemy. They would be slamming into the heavily fortified defensive belts of the PAVN 320th Division. The combat would instantly devolve into brutal, close-quarters trench warfare. The Marines would rely heavily on the M40 recoilless rifle, a 106mm weapon firing high-explosive plastic tracer rounds to bust open concrete bunkers. Flamethrowers carrying 70 pounds of jellied gasoline would be brought up to clear the spider hole complexes. The temperature on the beach would be pushing 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity hovering near 95%. Men carrying 80 pounds of combat gear, ammunition, and water would be dropping from heatstroke before they even took an enemy bullet. But what about the Sky Cavalry? What about the First Cavalry Division and their fleet of UH-1 Hueys executing the deep vertical envelopment to cut off Hanoi? The airmobile concept was revolutionary, but it relied on one critical assumption: the suppression of enemy air defenses. If you lose control of the lower atmosphere, your helicopters become flying coffins. Let us look at the anatomy of a helicopter assault into a hot landing zone. The standard Huey carried a crew of 4 and a squad of 8 heavily armed infantrymen. It was powered by a Lycoming T-53 turboshaft engine, producing 1,400 shaft horsepower. But the skin of the Huey was unarmored aluminium, barely thicker than a soda can. The vital components, the engine, the transmission, and the tail rotor drive shaft, were highly vulnerable to ground fire. The North Vietnamese had perfected the art of the flak trap. They knew that helicopters required large, relatively flat clearings to land. Giap's commanders would deliberately leave an inviting clearing, seemingly undefended, but ring the perimeter with triangulated anti-aircraft positions hidden in the tree line. Their weapon of choice was the DSHK heavy machine gun, a 12.7mm weapon roughly equivalent to the American .50 caliber. Firing a massive armor-piercing incendiary round at 600 rounds per minute, the DSHK could tear a Huey in half. As the American Armada descended into the landing zones of the Red River Valley, they would be met by a wall of green tracer fire. Imagine the chaos inside the troop compartment of a Huey taking fire. The deafening roar of the rotors is drowned out by the metallic hammering of heavy machine gun rounds punching through the floorboards. Hydraulic lines sever, spraying highly flammable fluid across the cabin. The pilots, sitting on armored seats but exposed from the waist up, struggle to maintain cyclic control as the aircraft shudders under the impacts. If a 12.7mm round strikes the tail rotor, the helicopter instantly loses anti-torque control, entering a violent, uncontrollable spin before plummeting into the jungle below. The First Cavalry Division would undoubtedly secure their landing zones because American infantry always fights its way through, but the cost in downed aircraft and shattered bodies would be staggering. Once on the ground, the airmobile infantry would face a terrifying reality. They were light infantry, dropped deep behind enemy lines, completely cut off from heavy armoured support. This is the exact nightmare scenario the British 1st Airborne Division faced at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden in 1944. You can drop elite troops behind the lines, but if the heavy armour cannot break through to relieve them, they will eventually be surrounded and annihilated by conventional enemy forces. The 1st Cav would have their lightweight 105mm artillery, but they would be facing PAVN regular divisions equipped with massive 152mm towed howitzers and BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers. The Grad system could ripple-fire 40 122mm rockets in 20 seconds, saturating an American landing zone with thousands of pounds of high explosives in the blink of an eye. How long can a light infantry battalion hold out against a mechanized, heavily armed conventional army when the weather turns, and the resupply helicopters cannot fly. Because the weather always turns in Vietnam. By late May, the southwest monsoon would slam into the Indochinese peninsula. The skies over Hanoi and the Red River Delta would turn to a bruised, violent purple. Torrential rains, dropping inches of water per hour, would flood the paddies, wash out the dirt roads, and ground the tactical air support. The mighty F-4 Phantom, the workhorse of the U.S. Air Force, equipped with advanced radar and laser-guided munitions, is utterly useless if it cannot see the target through a thunderstorm or if the cloud ceiling drops below 500 feet. This is the moment the North Vietnamese would launch their counter-offensive. Stripped of their close air support, their armor bogged down in the mud, and their supply lines stretched to the breaking point, the American forces would be locked in a grinding war of attrition. The combat would shift to the urban centers, places like Nam Dinh and the outskirts of Haiphong. Urban warfare is the great equalizer. It negates the American advantage in long-range firepower and maneuver. In the narrow, rubble-strewn streets, the M16 rifle, with its high-velocity but lightweight bullet, often struggled to penetrate the thick masonry walls of French colonial buildings. The pave-in infantry, utilizing the heavier 7.62mm round of the AK-47, could punch right through brick and mortar. American squads would have to clear buildings room by room, throwing M67 fragmentation grenades through windows and following up with bursts of automatic fire. It is a slow, agonizing process where casualties are measured in yards gained. The U.S. military would rely on CS tear gas to flush defenders out of basements and sewer systems, followed by the terrifying deployment of the M132 armored flamethrower, a modified M113 personnel carrier capable of shooting a stream of burning napalm over 200 feet. The destruction of the northern cities would be absolute, mirroring the apocalyptic ruins of Stalingrad or Hue City. But the pave-in defenders would simply retreat into the rubble, turning every collapsed roof and shattered factory floor into a sniper hide or a machine gun nest. The logistical strain on the American war machine would be catastrophic. A single U.S. Army division in heavy combat consumes up to 3,000 tons of supplies every single day. Ammunition, diesel fuel, medical supplies, and rations must flow continuously. But with Highway 1 heavily mined and constantly ambushed, and the air corridors shut down by the monsoon and radar-guided SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, the supply pipeline would choke. Artillery batteries would be forced to ration their shells, firing only in dire emergencies. Medevac helicopters, the lifeline of the wounded American soldier, would be unable to punch through the weather and the anti-aircraft fire, leaving thousands of critically injured men to bleed out in the mud of the Delta. The grim reality of this hypothetical invasion is that the United States military would not be defeated in a single, decisive battle. They would be slowly, methodically bled to death by 1,000 cuts, drowning in a logistical nightmare of their own making, fighting an enemy that was perfectly adapted to the environment. The generals in Washington who feared this scenario were not cowards. They were realists who understood the limitations of conventional military power in an unconventional theater. But the tactical nightmare on the ground was only half the equation. As the American divisions ground to a halt in the mud of the Red River Delta, the radar operators on the cruisers of the 7th Fleet, stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin, would begin to see something utterly terrifying on their screens. Massive, coordinated troop movements, not from the south, but pouring across the northern border, signaling that the sleeping giant of Asia had finally awakened. The intelligence reports flooding into the Military Assistance Command Vietnam would paint a picture of apocalyptic proportions. The sleeping giant of Asia was not just awake, it was mobilizing with a speed and ferocity that defied Western logistical models. We are talking about the Chinese People's Liberation Army, a force that had undergone massive modernization since the Korean War, now pouring across the Friendship Pass and the mountainous border crossings of Lang Son and Lao Cai. The initial wave would not be a ragtag militia, but regular, heavy combat divisions of the PLA's Gwangju and Kunming military regions. Imagine the sheer kinetic weight of 300,000 fresh, highly disciplined Chinese infantrymen slamming into the exhausted, mud-soaked northern flank of the American invasion force. They would be equipped with the Type 56 assault rifle, a Chinese-manufactured clone of the AK-47, featuring a distinctive folding spike bayonet and firing the same devastating 7.62mm round. But the PLA of 1968 was not just an infantry force. They brought heavy armor. The Chinese Type 59 main battle tank, a direct copy of the Soviet T-54, would roll down the mountain passes. Weighing 36 tons and boasting up to 200 millimeters of cast steel turret armor, the Type 59 was armed with a 100 millimeter rifled gun that could easily penetrate the frontal glacis of an American M48 Patton tank at 1,000 yards. How does a United States mechanized division, already bogged down in the flooded rice paddies of the Red River Delta and bleeding from 1,000 guerrilla ambushes, pivot to face a fresh, conventional army of this magnitude? The brutal truth is, they do not. This scenario is the exact nightmare that haunted the corridors of the Pentagon, because they had seen it before. It is impossible to analyze an invasion of North Vietnam without looking directly at the ghosts of the Cho Sin Reservoir in 1950. General Douglas MacArthur had pushed his forces to the Yalu River, convinced the Chinese would not intervene, only to have his Eighth Army shattered by massive human wave assaults in the freezing mountains of North Korea. The tactical parallels are terrifying, but the environment in North Vietnam would make the retreat from Cho Sin look like a textbook maneuver. At Cho Sin, the cold froze weapons and vehicles, but the ground was solid. In the Red River Delta during the monsoon, the ground simply ceases to exist. American armor, attempting to reposition to face the Chinese thrust, would find themselves trapped on elevated dirt dikes, sitting ducks for Chinese anti-tank battalions wielding Type 56 rocket-propelled grenades and recoilless rifles. This brings us to the catastrophic failure of strategic intelligence that would have been required to authorize this invasion in the first place. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency relied heavily on overhead reconnaissance, utilizing the SR-71 Blackbird, flying at Mach 3, and early Corona spy satellites. But high-altitude photography has a fatal flaw in Southeast Asia. It cannot see through the triple canopy jungle, and it is completely blinded by the dense cloud cover of the monsoon season. The North Vietnamese and the Chinese were masters of camouflage and night movement. They did not move in massive, easily identifiable mechanized convoys during daylight hours. They moved by foot, by bicycle, and by rail under the cover of darkness, hiding entire divisions in subterranean cave networks and camouflaged jungle staging areas before dawn. The American military establishment, high on the hubris of their own technological supremacy, would have marched into a strategically engineered trap, miscalculating not only the enemy's strength, but the political threshold of their nuclear-armed neighbors. The logistical mathematics of a two-front war in North Vietnam are staggering. Let us look at the raw numbers required to keep an American army alive in heavy combat. A single battery of 6 M114 155mm towed howitzers firing in support of infantry requires roughly 1,000 rounds of ammunition per day during intense engagements. Each high-explosive shell weighs 95 pounds. That is nearly 100,000 pounds of steel and explosives that must be transported from a deep-water port, loaded onto trucks, and driven to the firebase every single day, just for one battery. Now multiply that by the dozens of artillery battalions required to support a corps-level invasion. In World War II, the United States solved this with the Red Ball Express, a massive fleet of thousands of supply trucks rolling continuously across the relatively flat paved road networks of liberated France. But in North Vietnam, there is no open highway. There is only Highway 1, a narrow, elevated causeway surrounded by water, heavily mined, and pre-sighted by enemy artillery. If the trucks cannot get through, you must rely on air supply. A UH-47 Chinook helicopter can lift roughly 10,000 pounds of cargo. It would take 10 perfectly executed Chinook sorties, flying through a gauntlet of radar-guided SA-2 surface-to-air missiles and heavy anti-aircraft fire, just to keep one artillery battery firing for one day. When the Chinese divisions enter the fray and the consumption of ammunition triples, the American logistical tether simply snaps. We must also analyze the devastating economic and political shockwaves that would tear through the United States. In 1968, the American economy was already straining under the dual burden of President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society domestic programs and the escalating costs of the Vietnam War. An invasion of the North, triggering a direct conflict with China, would require a massive, immediate mobilization of the national industrial base. The military-industrial complex would demand billions of dollars in emergency funding to replace the staggering losses of helicopters, tanks, and aircraft. The United States was still on the gold standard at this time, and the sudden explosion of deficit spending would trigger catastrophic inflation, threatening to collapse the value of the dollar on the global market. Furthermore, the human cost would be unbearable. The selective service system would have to drastically increase draft quotas, pulling hundreds of thousands of young American men out of colleges and factories and throwing them into a meat grinder. If the historical Tet Offensive, which resulted in roughly 4,000 American combat deaths over a few months, fractured the political will of the nation, imagine the impact of 10 or 15,000 dead Americans in a single month of conventional warfare in the North. The anti-war protests in Chicago and Washington would not just be demonstrations, they would border on open insurrection. The strategic lesson here is deeply rooted in the Clausewitzian trinity of war, which states that any successful military campaign requires a balance between the government, the military, and the people. You can possess the most technologically advanced military machine in human history, capable of delivering unfathomable tons of high explosives with pinpoint accuracy. But if your political objectives are fundamentally flawed, and if the civilian population will not tolerate the blood and treasure required to achieve those objectives, your military superiority is meaningless. The United States military is designed, trained, and equipped to destroy enemy armies in open combat. It is not designed to occupy a hostile, densely populated, heavily armed nation whose very existence is guaranteed by a neighboring superpower. To find a historical precedent for the sheer brutality of what occupying North Vietnam would look like, we do not look to Europe. We look to the Pacific theatre of World War II, specifically the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. On Okinawa, the US Navy and Marine Corps faced a deeply entrenched, fanatical Japanese defense network built into the limestone caves and ridges of the island. The American forces had absolute air and naval supremacy, unleashing the greatest naval bombardment in history. Yet it still took 82 days of horrific close-quarters combat, costing over 12,000 American lives, and resulting in the near-total annihilation of the local civilian population to secure an island that was only 60 miles long. North Vietnam is roughly 63,000 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, populated by 20 million people who had been fighting foreign occupiers for centuries. An American occupation would be Okinawa scaled up by a factor of 1,000. Every village would be a fortress, every dike a trench line, and every jungle trail a kill zone. Ultimately, the invasion of North Vietnam was the war Washington feared because it was a tactical fantasy that ignored strategic reality. The field commanders who begged to march north were looking at the war through the narrow lens of battlefield geometry, believing that if they could just destroy the enemy's capital, the insurgency in the south would wither and die. But they failed to understand that Hanoi was not the center of gravity. The political will of the Vietnamese people and the geopolitical red lines of the Cold War were. The strategic restraint exercised by the politicians in Washington, while deeply frustrating to the men dying in the jungles of the South, was arguably the only thing that prevented a localized conflict from escalating into World War III. The restraint was not born of cowardice, but of a cold, terrifying calculation of the geopolitical chessboard. War is never just a clash of steel and high explosives. It is a brutal contest of logistics, political endurance, and the unforgiving nature of geography. The hypothetical invasion of North Vietnam stands as a monumental warning about the limits of conventional power in an asymmetric world. It reminds us that unleashing the full might of a superpower without a clear, achievable political end state is a recipe for catastrophic failure. Now it is time to hear from you, the tactical community. Based on the logistical and geopolitical realities we just dissected, what do you believe would have been the ultimate outcome if the US had invaded North Vietnam in 1968? Option A: a swift American victory, followed by a tense but stable Cold War standoff with China. Option B: a grueling multi-year stalemate that ends in a negotiated American withdrawal, similar to the historical outcome, but with vastly higher casualties. Or Option C: the immediate intervention of Chinese and Soviet forces, triggering a global, potentially nuclear, Third World War. Drop your answer, A, B, or C, in the comments below, and defend your tactical reasoning.